Hello, everybody. Oh, so I've already got a deep voice, right? So when I shout into the mic, it creates a bit of chaos in the speakers. Lovely to see you all. As mentioned, my name is Luke Graham. I'm an associate fellow at Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. I'm also the head of research and strategic insights at a venture capital firm in the UK, based out of London, called Pi Labs. And over the coming 30 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about the intersection between quality of life and technology in cities of the future. And of course, I acknowledge the irony of traveling from a very historical, old school city like London/Oxford to deliver this in a very futuristic city such as Riyadh. But hopefully there are some transferable lessons between the two markets. A fun little tidbit here, it was about 13 years ago, around 13 or 14 years ago, that I came to Saudi Arabia for the first time. And when I did, I had the opportunity to travel a bit further up the Red Sea and visit a place called Petra in Jordan, which I'm sure many people here are familiar with. And I find this to be a useful case study for the work that we've been doing on the future of cities out of Saïd Business School at Oxford. In particular because many Westerners refer to Petra as the lost city of Petra, okay? And the reason behind that, of course, is that Petra is no longer the thriving metropolis, the capital of the Nabatean kingdom that it was historically. And the question is why? What happened? Okay, this was a grand feat of engineering, this city, and today, of course, a significant tourist attraction, over 1 million visitors every single year, but no longer technically a functioning city, okay? And the reason behind that, for the historians in the room, the people will remember, was innovation, okay? Innovation disrupted Petra. So when the Romans did their thing across a big part of the Eurasian supercontinent, they brought with them shipborne commerce. And the challenge for Petra was that its significance was as a land-based space for trade, okay? So the history of the Nabateans, of course, was originally that they were bandits and that they would raid some of the trade networks that you can see up on the screen here. And once the Romans came along and started doing this at sea instead of on land, all the famous ports, Alexandria, Gaza, and many of these other places rose to significance, and Petra steadily declines. Now, there are a few interesting things around this, right? And we see this in a number of other cities all around the world. Archaeological evidence tells us that Petra, and you may comfortably assume this anyway, that Petra didn't just close shop overnight. There was a steady decay, there was steady decline, okay? So it went from being the peak of the Nabatean kingdom to steadily people living in homes that were falling into disrepair, examples of the city, dropping in population steadily over time and all these sorts of things. But the interesting thing, obviously, looking into the future is that the future of human population growth over the remainder of this century is urban. Okay, so you may have heard the old phrase that 1.5 billion people added to our population by 2050 are going to be all concentrated in cities. And we see some of the effects of that here in Riyadh, and we see it in many of the other global cities around the world as well. And so the case to you is that the future of humanity, if we want to start getting a bit philosophical, is the future of cities, okay? But the challenge is, if we look all the way back to Charles Dickens, if there are any fans of Charles Dickens in the room, the English author, we know that city growth is imperfect and quality of life can be shaken up in this process of urbanization, okay? So for A Christmas Carol, the Dickensian film of the Victorian era, Scrooge, the character Scrooge, if you've heard of this character, who bemoans the surplus population, okay? Casting our minds to the image on the right-hand side, okay, of overflowing London slums and these sorts of things. And of course, in the modern day, we see some examples on the left of the consequences of rapid urbanization and the challenges around quality of life that it may inflict on its people. But what is quality of life? Okay, quality of life is the topic of this talk. What does it mean to each of the people in this room? There are, I don't know, I'm terrible at counting in this sort of context, but there is however many people in this room right now and however equal many number of opinions or perspectives on what quality of life means to you. Why do you choose to live in the city you choose to live in? Is it because you just happen to be born there and you have social networks and you're comfortable living where is familiar? Did you move to another city drawn by employment, by healthcare, by social mobility, so on and so forth, maybe by entertainment? Now, if you can tell from my accent, I'm not British, right? I don't have the posh Oxford accent that I'm supposed to have. I was born in Australia, and in some indexes, the cities of Australia rank among the highest in the world. Why did I choose to move to London, right? Where there is crime and serious social inequality and a bunch of other challenges. Is it because I love the London's West End? Am I a fan of Piccadilly Circus and Oxford Street and all those sorts of things? What is it that drives me to want to live in this city? And so what I did at Pi Labs, at the venture capital firm, is I looked at a bunch of these quality of life indexes, okay? And they're the rows. These are the rows that you can see here. The famous one is from the Economist Intelligence Unit, right? That ranks Vienna as the world's most livable city usually, sometimes Melbourne, other times Vancouver, okay? But then there are other indexes here, and I know that text is very small. Main point is colors, okay? Main focus here is colors. Some of these indexes rank these global economic powerhouses as the most livable cities in the world. So you see London ranking highly, New York ranking highly, Tokyo ranking highly. And so what this really reinforces to us is that, again, quality of life is subjective, right? It depends on what you're measuring. And so when you break all these indexes apart and you try to put them back together again into a few different groups, you get 100 indicators. These indicators are these these columns the whole way across, right? Tiny text you can barely see, okay? An example, quality of public, I can't see that one. The ease of the threat of military conflict. Sorry, okay, as an example. Now, all the green are within each row represent what they are counting, and the red is obviously what they're not counting. Yellow is a little bit undetermined. They either were a bit secretive about exactly what they were measuring, or were able to surmise it in some other way. And so the key drivers of livability we see are healthy cities, and you can see across the top here, experiential cities, right? The enjoyment people get out of cities, what draw people to places like London and Paris and things like that, why I'm in London instead of Sydney. Sustainable cities, okay? So talking here about biophilia, when I came in from the airport this morning, you know, a lot of investments being made into biophilic design along the highway, okay? A lot of natural elements integrated there. It's very pretty and picturesque. We have developed cities, urban development, construction, prop tech, the sort of stuff we're talking about a lot today. Secure cities, obviously safety, thinking, innovation, and then productive cities, big economic conversation here. Future of work, productivity, all these sorts of things, okay? These are the categories that we consider to be the main drivers of quality of life in the cities of tomorrow. And so what I'm going to propose to you in the context of prop tech, startup, venture capital, innovation, is that we can start looking into the future of these cities on the basis of how much they're innovating in each of these areas. And one way of doing that, with this very pretty graphic, is through the amount of venture-funded entrepreneurship taking place in each of the categories. Now, this particular graphic is specific to Europe, okay? But obviously a very close neighbor. of the Middle East. Now, productive cities, that economic story, okay, future of work, productivity apps, Monday.com, all those sorts of things, okay, that's a big pool of capital that's being funded substantially. But then, if you look at some of these other areas, thinking cities and experiential cities, much less so, okay? And so this may give us a little bit of a hint as to what the trajectory of the human experience in cities could be based on what's actually being backed, what's being funded. And I'll propose to you a few other ways of looking at this as well in this talk. But the big question that we're often asked by property developers, municipalities, construction firms, real estate investors, wherever the capital is coming from, buying or acquiring technology, they're often saying to us, okay, well, they told us that we can make people healthier in a building, or a supplier told us they could do X, Y, Z, but we need a business case here. We need a financial upside. We need an economic case. So what is the economic case of quality of life? Is quality of life more than just an ESG metric? Okay, is it more than just environmental and social sustainability? My case to you is that we tinkered with a little bit of relatively straightforward maths here. So the engineers in the room and the mathematicians in the room, will chuckle at the elementary level of say algebra that we propose here. But it seems to be prompting a little bit more action when we start having these conversations. And excuse the currency used here being in British pounds, but obviously that's where we conducted the research. So my first question to you is a healthy building a profitable building? Is a healthy building a profitable building? And when we calculated this for commercial real estate, one argument that healthy building technology often makes to their buyers is that we can reduce sick days in your building, increase productivity, and so on and so forth. And so when that's actually the case, when you can reduce sick days that take place, the average number of sick days that are created from within a building, we know that indoor air quality is far inferior to outdoor air quality, and that's what creates a lot of that's why we're all sick in winter, okay, because we're all locked up inside. So if we're able to mitigate this through a bunch of technologies that I'll bring up a little bit later, there is an economic case here. So for a 500,000 square foot building, which is roughly 50,000 square meters, 3.2 million British pound of added annual economic activity takes place in that building every year, just by reducing the average sick days each year by 1. You just have to drop your average sick days by 1 to create that added economic activity. Okay? Biophilic design, I mentioned it before. See it in the external built environment, the whole way from the airport to this hotel. Why was that investment made? Why was that done? There are two elements, key elements I would point to for biophilic design in the built environment. Number one is a very well-established point, and we can actually see it right here, right now, actually, at the tables at the front here in this room, that green elements and blue elements, blue and green, right, water and nature, have a psychological effect on our state of subjective mental health, okay, or subjective well-being. We've known that for a long time. Psychology has known this for a long time. Take a walk in nature, escape to the country, all these sorts of things, okay? We know this. We integrate timber into our internal architecture for this reason, okay, when we don't necessarily have to. But more recently, there's also been a lot of academic research on productivity gains from these interventions as well. And to boot, it doesn't even necessarily have to be real. So what they've done in some cases is use virtual reality and change the outlook of a person conducting tasks and seeing how that affects their performance on those tasks. And we know that integrating green elements improves productivity. Anywhere from around 5% in more modest cases, up to 20% in some cases. So if we just go onto the conservative side of that, if we just say, okay, well, how about 5%? Let's work with 5%. In a 5% improvement scenario, This is the big one. 41.5 million pound of added economic activity takes place inside that 50,000 square meter building each year, just from a 5% productivity improvement scenario. Okay, this is the business case, this is the opportunity. Obviously, big challenge is on how to actually achieve this. Finally, who here in the room is familiar with a gentleman by the name of Adam Neumann? Adam Neumann? WeWork? Who here is familiar with WeWork? Yep. Adam Neumann, founder of WeWork, okay? Adam Neumann, obviously WeWork has had quite a lot of attention in the press over many years. And Adam Neumann has obviously exited a few years back now and started a new venture called Flow Space. And if I'm to be a little bit reductionist here, I would say Flow Space is maybe somewhat of a WeWork for residential real estate, okay? Focusing very heavily in the US. And when he launched this platform alongside the venture capital firm A16Z Andreessen Horowitz, he was interviewed by one of the founders of that VC firm, and he made the business case, right? He made the argument that if people feel a greater sense of ownership of their spaces, they'll take better care of it, and the investor / the owner will make more money. They'll increase their NOI, their net operating income, on that building. And the metaphor that Neumann used was that, instead of calling the superintendent to unblock the toilet, that the occupier would do it themselves, right? Now, a lot of grief he received in the media for this, but with the real estate economics training, I thought to myself, I want to test this out myself mathematically, okay? And this is the third, I promise this is the last time I throw an equation at you today. But this is the third equation, the third and final equation. That a higher sense of ownership, which can be proved in psychology, right? It's called psychological ownership. If you can prove psychological ownership of any entity, doesn't have to be a piece of real estate, it can be a car, okay? It can be any consumer product. It can even be these flowers here at the corner of the stage. I can say, this one's mine, and sir, this one's yours. Now, whether you like it or not, you've got a higher affinity with this container of flowers than this one, right? You may shake your head and say that's nonsense. We have psychological ownership within us when it comes to many different things. Now, homes are a significant example. We may not own our homes, we may rent them, right? But we hold an affinity to them. We hold a sense of psychological ownership over our friends, over different products, over maybe a certain seat in a cafeteria, right? Or a restaurant. Okay, I particularly prefer to sit here. This is my spot. And there's a TV show called The Big Bang Theory, right? Where the character Sheldon Cooper, if you've seen it, American sitcom, that's my spot. Okay? He doesn't own that. There's psychological ownership of that space. So marketers, psychologists know psychological ownership very well. Then when we move that into real estate economics and we look at the impact that that has on churn, on occupier churn, we then have a scenario where we can extend the occupancy of a building. And all other things held equal, premiums on prices and all those sorts of things, you reduce the quantity of vacancies over the long term of your building and therefore increase your income. And so, at the end of the day, 1.7 million pound of added economic activity, annual gross rental income in this case, taking place if you moved your average occupancy from 3 to 4 years. But the question is how? Okay, how can this be achieved? And of course, this is what brings us into the core of the conference over today and tomorrow around innovation, property technology, and those sorts of things. And so working from the venture capital lens, a key question we have is around what sort of technology is being framed by the built environment, the real estate sector, and what's at its periphery. And so I propose this three-staged framing for built world technology that affects the built world. In the center, you've got built world centric, your prop tech, your construction tech, your mobility tech, right? The second one is adjacent to the built world. You know, it directly affects the built world, but maybe not necessarily is considered within the conventional domains of prop tech and contech. And then the third is peripheral. And so when we look at healthy cities, right, and we look at this framing, in the middle, in built world centric, what can be reliably considered to be prop tech can be things, say, like air quality monitoring within a building, or perhaps wastewater analytics to preempt disease within a building and the spread of disease and things like that, okay? All integrated within the built environment. But then if we go all the way out to the peripheral, who in the room has a smartwatch or some sort of wearable? Yep, several people in the room. So there's a podcaster in the UK, his name's Stephen Bartlett. And he was talking about his experience with the smart wearable technology, okay? He was saying that whenever he went out and drank alcohol with his friends on a Saturday night or something like that, he would wake up on a Sunday morning and his smartwatch would say to him, your heart rate variability has dropped. What did you do to yourself yesterday? Are you sure you're still alive? Right? What's going on? And this created a significant behavioral shift in Stephen Bartlett. He stopped drinking alcohol. And in many, especially across Generation Z, in many parts of Western markets, we're seeing a reduction in consumption of alcohol. Right? It's not all because of wearables. There are other cultural forces at play. But how does that behavioral shift affect the built environment? It's maybe not an immediate first order effect, but it's at least a second order effect. Okay, if we're building our cities surrounding certain cultural ideas, attitudes, behaviors that are shifting, that's going to also shift the way that the urban environment needs to be designed and maintained and so on. When it comes to sustainable buildings, we have a similar example. Obviously, there's a lot of sustainable building technology, energy efficiency in buildings, solar, so on and so forth. But then even still, getting into the peripheral. When it comes to biophilic design, right, urban biodiversity, things like this, a lot of people may ask, well, like, what does that have to do with technology? And I think something that's quite interesting is that we're now seeing at the design stage technology being used to more effectively integrate urban biodiversity into the built environment, because just throwing a tree somewhere actually could do more harm than good. One thing they've recently identified in London as an example is that all the trees that they threw into that city over certain periods of time, number one, and I didn't realize this, and I may butcher this, they put too many male trees in London because they didn't want the fruit from the female trees to create too much cleanup. So now there's too much pollen in London. That's why if you ever go into London in the spring and your allergies are really flaring up, it's because all the trees are guys, right? Or too many guys. Similar issues with volatile organic compounds. So in other areas, they've found we didn't do our biodiversity strategy properly, and now we've got VOCs spurting into the air at different times of the year because of the incorrect, again, biodiversity elements. So using technology to make those interventions in a more thoughtful way, but then also this emerging field of biodiversity as a service, right? So a lot of exciting areas in the sector. Third, again, going to the experiential cities, going to experience the experience. We have familiar tenant engagement apps, but also developments in augmented reality and virtual reality, placemaking initiatives. There's a development in London called King's Cross, for those of you who have been there recently, that is very heavily focused on the occupier experience, the retailer experience. How can we shift this trend backwards from the Amazonification of retail, okay, and drive footfall back into these more intensive human experiences in whether it's retail or hospitality or whatever it happens to be. Now, I showed more than just 3 categories of quality of life, okay? The last one, thinking cities, I think is a really interesting point because of all the work being done around Vision 2030 here in Saudi Arabia. So one thing we identified when we were doing this research is that when you look at quality of life and innovation, distinct groups emerge. And I was really fascinated by this. So quality of life and innovation. We're looking at innovation upwards on the y-axis, patents per million people, innovation intensity. And on the x-axis, we're looking at the quality of life of certain cities in Europe, okay? Now, the first group, which may be intuitive, high quality of life, high levels of innovation, okay? Makes sense. People who feel good, do good work. The next one I call the lazy cities, and as I gestured to, I'm Australian, so the city that I always pick on for this, high quality of life, very low innovation, Perth. Okay, Perth is a horrible innovator, and they're really wrestling with this. So as a proportion of GDP within the city, Perth's level of innovation is sub 1%. Okay, very low, about 0.5. And then you have, thirdly, low quality of life, low innovation. Therefore, what you do not have in all the cases that we looked at is you never have low quality of life and high innovation. Okay? So what we've identified here is what we consider to be, in the top right-hand side, a reinforcing feedback loop of quality of life and innovation, right? If we're developing technology and innovation to drive quality of life is therefore a driver of innovation. We end up in a virtuous cycle between those two elements. Quality of life and innovation, quality of life, innovation, and so on. Of course, you need to be innovating in the right areas. There's plenty of innovation in terrible areas, right? The most innovative periods in human history, the most innovative periods of human history have been the worst wars that we've fought. The greatest technological leaps forward that we've made as humanity have been the recent world wars, as an example. And so breaking out of that and engaging in the sorts of innovation that we're seeing in this country is, I think, quite an aspirational way of innovating. And so when we looked at this from the European angle, okay, what the outlook for innovation looks, and this applies globally. This is transferable globally. It's not just a European phenomenon. We look at endogenous innovation, what innovation is happening inside that city, what sort of startups are being founded in that city, okay? Then general innovativeness, that's in this case determined by the EU and therefore constrained to Europe. And then exogenous innovation. This one we accomplished via a survey, essentially by asking entrepreneurs and innovators, how likely are you, or rank your priorities of cities to expand into the future? And so I guess my challenge or my question to you in the context of Riyadh is, how can Riyadh establish itself as high as possible on that hierarchy, right? And so innovators from all around the world are like, we want to deploy our products as a high priority in Riyadh. So once we were done with that analysis, this is how the European cities ranked. Now, you may agree or disagree with this. I saw a Dutchman in the audience a little earlier. I think he might still be here, Wouter. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that Amsterdam is number 2 and not number 1. But this is how European cities rank. But again, we can bring this out more regionally. The key point, I think, here is that London does not rank as the most livable city in Europe today. It ranks as the potentially most livable city in Europe into the future based on the level of innovation that takes place there. Here are some other alternative rankings that we produced. So the leader on carbon, as an example, is Stockholm. And some of the small, punching above their weight sort of cities that had special mentions from our entrepreneurs included Warsaw, in Poland, Manchester in the UK, and Bucharest, of course, in Romania. And finally, on per capita performance as well, which is a bit more of a punching above their weight metric, Luxembourg, you may make a point there around capital, Stockholm and Amsterdam. So my key question to you, and my key point off the back of this research that we were doing, again, centrally focused around European cities in its first iteration, is what transferable lessons there are for the highly ambitious work being done in this country.